and I need a deeper love. Apparently, I'm not alone, wanting flesh for this heart of stone. There's a place above the street, yeah, where no dark dangers creep, and the love we share is sweet. In the upper, come with me to the upper. We've been called to the upper room, the place of prayer. Let's climb the stairs, bring our cares to the upper room. There will be tongues of fire to fan the flame with mighty wind, and on our lips a new language. The Holy Spirit enters in. Oh, 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 oh. Let's return, let's agree, we'll meet again on bended knee. I pray for you, please pray for me. The Spirit comes when there's unity. We will change our stance when we feel God's glance, and the dry bones dance, and the upper, hey, there will be tongues of fire to fan the flame. been called to the upper room, the place of prayer. Let's climb the stairs, bring our cares to the upper room. There is a resting place where the weary can lie down. Wash off all their cares with the soap of broken prayers. Break the fever on their brow. Lie down. In the summer of your youth, when you come in from play, and your soul's been bruised, so you worry about the new day. Come to this resting place, lie down. Lie down. You lead me beside these waters that restore my soul. I'll drink till I thirst no more, till I thirst no more. Dodging arrows every day, terrors every night. Sleep just will not come, so I'm reaching for the light. Reaching for your face, and I lie down. Lie down. You lead me beside these waters, restore my soul. I'll drink till I thirst no more, till I thirst no more. Lie down. Lie down. Lie down. Lie down. stole my soul. I'll drink till I thirst no more, till I thirst no more, and lie down, lie down, lie down, lie down.
I want to talk today about the idea of calling. Now, there are a lot of stories in the Bible that talk about this idea of calling, or being called by God. A lot of people, they often look to the story of Abraham as one of the most famous, or to Moses, or just the Israelite people in general. Some people look to the story of Jonah. Today, I want to focus in on a story that I believe articulates calling just as much, but one that is not focused on nearly enough, in my opinion. It's the story of the Apostle Paul. See, Paul was once a very misunderstood man. He used to go by a different name named Saul, and he's been accused throughout history as a number of things. People have accused him of being a brute. People have accused him of being a womanizer, and many other things that I probably cannot say in a church sermon. And while I don't agree with any of those statements about him, one thing that people do note, and one thing I do agree with, is that Paul understood what it meant to be called by God. Now, I'm not going to read the whole story of Paul's life today because it would take us probably the whole day. Because if you didn't already know, Paul's life is recorded throughout much of the New Testament. In fact, he wrote nearly half of it. So I want to summarize. So picture this, right? Paul, he was a man with a good education. He had favorable status in society. He was both in good standing with Jewish religious leaders, and also he was a Roman citizen. So what that meant is that he was a Pharisee, okay? He was part of the in crowd. He was part of the people that had influence in that world. These were the people that got Jesus crucified. He was favored both in belief, and he was also favored in the political realm. So he's got a lot going for him. And he chooses to set out on this vendetta to take out Christians. And why is he doing this? Well, he believes that they're threatening his way of life. And in the process of doing this, he actually becomes a witness to the first recorded Christian that had been killed in the Bible, in the book of Acts, and that man's name was Stephen. Saul essentially gave his stamp of approval. He stood there and watched and approved of what was happening. But something changes, and Paul is on his way, or Saul is on his way at this point, to a city named Damascus. And he's riding on a horse, and a bright light comes from heaven. It knocks him off that horse, and it blinds him. And he hears a voice from heaven, and it's Jesus speaking to him. Paul then goes into this city, and he goes to one of these Christians that he's seeking out to imprison or to kill. And he gets healed by them. This is where things get crazy. He starts going by a different name. And I don't know about you, but it's a little weird when you give yourself your own nickname. And that's essentially what Paul does here. He changes his name from Saul to Paul. And I don't know about you, but I've tried at one point in time to try and give myself my own nickname. Because when I was growing up, because my last name is White, My nickname growing up, my whole life, was Whitey. It was my brother's nickname. It was my nickname. And I thought it was so stupid because I would, get called, tidy whitey, things like that. Things that were just so irritating. And I tried to give myself my own nickname, and it didn't work out too well. And, people, they just didn't buy into it. And that's what happens for Paul. He changes his name to Paul from Saul. And people aren't really sure. In fact, the Christians, they didn't really believe this sudden change. They didn't, like me trying to give myself my own nickname when I was a kid, they said, no, this isn't Paul, this is Saul. We don't trust this man. We are not going to believe that he's been changed. The Jewish leaders, on the other hand, the people that Paul used to run with, they realize that he's a force to be reckoned with because he knows too much. He has influence and he's intelligent and educated. They were scared. So they set out to kill him. And when that didn't work, they set out to arrest him. So they arrest him. And Paul, he actually turns that out to be a good thing. He ends up preaching to numerous Roman officials, getting moved up the ladder, the chain of command. And they can't find anything wrong. They can't find anything that he's guilty of. But they keep him around because they're interested in what he has to say. They could sense this call of God on his life. And see, Paul, he was not in a good place. He was in prison. But he turns that out for good. He ends up preaching the gospel and people come to Christ because of that. Influential Roman officials. Paul is a lot of the reason why we have Christianity spread throughout the world. He's not the only reason, but he is one of the key figures that spread the gospel throughout his known world at the time. And because of that, it infected the Empire of Rome, which basically ruled the whole world at the time. That without Paul, without him taking a good attitude and listening to the call of God in a hard circumstance, you and I might not be listening to this today. We might not be watching this today. I might not be preaching this message today if it weren't for the call of God and the obedience on Paul's part. I want to read to you 2 Corinthians 11:24-28 today. And just listen to what has happened to him. This is Paul speaking. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. That's 39 times being whipped, but multiply that by 5. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger from false believers. I've been in danger in the city, in danger in the country, and in danger at sea. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Talk about a rough day at the office. I don't know about you, but I haven't ever been whipped. I haven't ever had someone beat me with rods, or I haven't been stoned, or I haven't been shipwrecked 3 times. And I don't have everyone hunting me down. His fellow Jews, Gentiles, okay? And then false believers. All these different groups of people, they had it out for him. So what can we learn from Paul's life and ministry? And how does that apply to us? Well, first, we must be called to follow Jesus. We talk a lot about calling and vocation in church, and we refer to it as a job. You know, God calls someone to go be a pastor. God calls someone to go do this or that. We first must be called to be Christians, regardless of what we do. And that's what Paul did. That's what he understood. He listened and he heard the voice of Jesus, and he understood that my life is different from this day forward. And I'm called to go spread the gospel. It wasn't to go be a pastor. It wasn't to go be a church planner. In fact, he had another job. He was a tent maker. Max Dupree puts it this way. He tells this story. And he says, in the furniture industry of the 1920s, the machines of most factories were not run by an electric motor, but by pulleys from a central drive shaft. The millwright was the person on whom the entire activity of the operation depended. He was the key person, says Max Dupree, who was the former CEO of Herman Miller. He goes on, one day, the millwright at Herman Miller died. My father, being a young manager at the time, did not know what to do when a key person had passed away, but thought that he ought to go visit the family. So he went to the house, was invited to join the family in the living room. The widow asked my father if it would be all right to read aloud some poetry. Naturally, he agreed. She went into the other room, came back with a bound book, and for many minutes read selected pieces of beautifully written poetry. And when she finished, my father commented on how beautiful the poetry was and asked who wrote it. She replied that her husband, the millwright, was the poet. It is now nearly 60 years since the millwright died, and my father and many of us at Herman Miller continue to wonder, was he a poet who did millwright's work? Or was he a millwright who wrote poetry? Was Paul a tent maker that did pastoral work? Or was he a pastor that made tents? Are you a insert job title here that does the Lord's work? Or are you a servant of the Lord that happens to fulfill another job? It's a simple shift in perspective, but I believe it's an important one. Another unknown source puts it like this. The noted English architect Sir Christopher Wren was supervising the construction of a magnificent cathedral in London. A journalist thought that it would be interesting to interview some of the workers. So he chose 3 and he asked them this question. What are you doing? The first replied, I'm cutting stone for 10 shillings a day. The next answered, I'm putting in 10 hours a day on this job. But the third said, I'm helping Sir Christopher Wren construct one of London's most beautiful cathedrals. The only way that we as the people of God will transform our world is if we understand that we are helping the creator of this universe complete a beautiful masterpiece. That we are helping the creator of this universe change and transform the beautiful masterpiece that is our world. Sure, our world is broken, but we must play a part. We must be like the third person in this story. We must not fall into the outlooks of I'm doing what I got to do. I'm working a lot. No, I get to be a servant of the Most High. Maybe we need to look at the opportunities that are right in front of us. Maybe it's not about finding a different job. Maybe it's not about changing where we work or the title that we have. Maybe it's about looking at the opportunities that are right in front of us and taking them. Maybe that coworker that drains your attention. Maybe that family member or friend that challenges your faith. Maybe that neighbor that you get so irritated by. Those are all opportunities for us to forward God's kingdom. Not to change them. God will do that in his own time. But for us to be an example, to be a light. See, if we're all called to make disciples, which we are, Jesus commands us of this, and we're not doing this, then he calls us lukewarm. He says this in Revelation, that if you are lukewarm, I would rather that you be hot or you be cold. But because you are lukewarm, I will spit you out of my mouth. There's a beauty in this coffee mug. And it's because this coffee mug, I made coffee at about 6:30 this morning when, a crying baby woke me up. This coffee's still hot. It's still hot. It's not lukewarm. It's not cold. It's just perfect. I don't know about you, but I like my coffee hot or cold. If I want cold coffee, I'm gonna have a nice coffee. I don't want it to be slightly warmed up. And if I'm gonna have a hot coffee, I want it to be hot. I don't want it to be lukewarm. Lukewarm coffee is gross. And that's the same attitude that Jesus has to us when we have a lukewarm faith. When we have a lukewarm example of sharing his gospel and his truth. So why do we fall into this trap? Why do we fall into the trap of being lukewarm? Of not being as much of an example as what we should be at times? Because what are we afraid of? See, Paul, he listened to the call that God had put on his life. He changed everything. He was put in prison for it. He was hunted down. He was threatened. And eventually he was killed because he chose to listen what God called him to. We need to do the same. The next thing that we must do is that we must be open to where God will take us. See, Paul, he traveled all over Europe and he shared the gospel everywhere that he went. It wasn't always comfortable. In fact, it was pretty uncomfortable at times. And what we have to come to terms with is that we have to learn how to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. I don't know about you, but that's not an easy thing to do a lot of the time. I like to be comfortable. But the trouble is when we chase after comfortability. And we get a glimpse of this in Jonah 1:1-3. This man, he was called by God, and this is what it says. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it. It is because their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, the story goes on, right? And you've probably heard this story before. Jonah, he ends up getting thrown into the sea, and then he gets swallowed by a great big fish. And then he gets puked up on the exact land that God called him to. I'm not saying that God is going to send a big giant fish out of the Detroit River to eat us today. That's not what I'm saying. Although, if the Lord tells someone that that's going to happen, please call me, text me, do whatever you can to get a hold of me, because I want to get that on video. Because there is great opportunity that if a big fish swallows you up today, I can get that, put that on the internet, and I can fund New Song Church for the next 30 years. But the truth is that, that's probably not going to happen. There's not going to be some big fish that God's going to send to eat someone today. So what does it mean? Well, it means that we need to be open to serving where God will take us. Jonah was not. Paul was. Paul was open to wherever God would lead him. Maybe that's a place that we don't want to go, though. Do you think that Paul wanted to go to every place that God called him to? I doubt it. Maybe that's a job that we really don't want to do. Does that mean, though, that serving God has to be a chore and be uncomfortable? No, it doesn't. Remember, first, we must shift our perspective of how and why we serve God. From this shift, everything flows. I know that for me, when I've allowed God to shift my perspective, then the uncomfortable things that came when I was serving God, they weren't so uncomfortable. The last thing that we must do is that we must be open to serving in all ways. Now, this is similar to the last point, but it is slightly different. See, God calls us to places or people that sometimes make us uncomfortable, but this point is more about the task. See, Paul, he served many churches. Most of the New Testament, as I said before, is written by him. The vast majority of those letters that Paul wrote were to specific churches in places that he helped either pastor that church or plant that church. Many of these churches were facing trials, and many of those trials were self-inflicted. How many trials do you have that are self-inflicted today? See, despite this, if you look at Paul's concern for these churches, the same way that God is concerned for you, Paul was still concerned about these churches, even though they had self-inflicted wounds, just like how God is still concerned for you, even in the midst of your self-inflicted wounds. I say this because it says this, right? In 2 Corinthians 11:28, besides everything else, I face daily, the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So what does this show us? It shows us that Paul did not give up hope. It shows us that he looked at the tasks that were in front of him that seemed daunting, but he did not give up. So how does that apply to you and me? Maybe it means that you need to enter that next task at work with joy. Maybe you need to stop complaining about your current job opportunity that you're a part of. We've complained a lot as the church in the midst of COVID. We're fortunate. In fact, I would say we are blessed. Sure, this season of life has been strange, to say the least, and it's been uncomfortable. But we don't have to fear for our lives. We don't have to be concerned about going to prison for our faith. It's been uncomfortable. But serving Jesus isn't always glamorous. Paul makes this clear throughout the New Testament. But he also makes one thing for certain, that serving Jesus should cause a great thankfulness within us. It says in Philippians 4:11-13, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in every and any situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who strengthens me. The fact that Paul says that should surprise us. Whatever the circumstances, he's learned to be content. He's faced a lot, as we read earlier. See, when we serve Jesus, when we listen to the call that God has placed on our lives, which the call is that you and I are called to go and love our world and to make disciples, we transform the world. And Paul, he reiterates, reiterates this message time and time again. Earlier in that same chapter, he says in Philippians 4:4-7, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Paul reiterates, rejoice. Do we rejoice in the Lord always? The fact that he says that, and he's been shipwrecked 3 times, whipped 39 times, times 5. He's been, people throwing rocks at him. He's been on the run, and everybody's been out to get him. And he's saying, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. It's a kick to the gut. We don't always do that. We don't always let our gentleness be evident to all. And most importantly, we are anxious. Paul says, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition. But he doesn't end it there. With thanksgiving, he says, with thanksgiving. Don't just bring your complaints to God, but bring thankfulness. And when we do that, he says, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Did you know that 1 in 4 Americans, this is an American stat, but it applies to us as well, 1 in 4 Americans this year will get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder? We have a hurting world around us, one that is fearful. And that was before COVID. COVID has just made it worse. We have a fearful world, an anxious world that doesn't know where to turn and where to find hope. We must be that hope. We must show others what it means to rejoice always, even in the midst of trials, even in the midst of our storms. That God, He surrounds us, He's with us, He loves us. Does it mean that things will be easy all the time? No. Does it mean that we can't be hurt? No, it doesn't mean that at all. We can. We can and we should, and we need to bring our hurts and our burdens to God. But in the midst of all of it, we need to learn what it means to rejoice in the Lord always. And we need to be a light to our world for them to understand that there's a reason for hope, a reason for peace, and a way to find freedom from anxiety. My hope, my prayer, and my challenge to myself and to you this week is that we would go be that. Go be that in your workplace if you're back to work. Go be that in your home. Go be that in your neighborhood with your neighbors. There is someone around you that is in need of freedom from anxiety. Go be that hope and go be that light.
Thank you, Pastor Adam, for that great message that we just heard. And I just want to mention that if you are interested in being a part of New Song Church, you have a calling from God. And sometimes as part of a calling, it's good to know where you belong and who you can be partnered with, who you can team with. And New Song Church is all about a team of people working together. You can find out more information. Why don't you give the church a call at 519-971-SONG and find out more about how you can get involved in the life of our church. We are meeting live, and if you haven't yet come out to a live service, you can call the church and reserve your seats. Also want to thank Pastor Adam for bringing a great message, and all the team that makes so many good things happen at New Song Church. I hope that God is blessing you today, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon.